Revenge pornography is the word we're familiar with, but that's just the tip of the iceberg. What we're talking about is a broad range of phenomena, broadly 5 different types. We're talking about classic revenge pornography, where the ex-partner distributes the images without consent. We're talking about hacked images. We're all familiar with Hunger Games actor Jennifer Lawrence and her private images being shared online. We're talking about voyeurism, someone in a changing rooms in their own home being filmed or photographed and that being shared online. We're talking about upskirting. As the name suggests, images being taken up someone's skirt without their consent and then shared online. And finally, we're talking about a really pernicious and growing concern where people are videoing actual sexual assaults and rapes and sharing them online. What we're seeing here is technology facilitating forms of sexual violence and abuse. We've got old harms, but being perpetrated in new ways. This is a deeply concerning problem. What you have is those who are victims, and it's mainly women who are victims of these forms of abuse. They're suffering shame because families are shunning them, friends are shunning them. Employers are finding out about the availability of these images, and sometimes people's livelihoods are being threatened. Some people fear for their own personal safety. Some of these websites show these images and they show the people's names, their addresses, and how to contact them. So these people are suffering real direct harms and real direct threats. In my research with my colleague Erika Rackley, we're identifying 3 main harms of this material. First is this fundamental breach of privacy. None of us should have to have these intimate images shared without our consent. It's a threat to our dignity. We all deserve the treatment of respect and concern, and the law should afford us protection of that dignity. And thirdly, it's about protecting sexual expression, and particularly women's sexual expression. What we find all too often in this area is the women, the victims, being blamed. One Daily Mail headline said, "Want to prevent revenge porn? Just keep your clothes on." That's not what this is about. We need to be focusing on the offender's actions. We need to challenge a culture in which men, predominantly it is men, are distributing these images online without consent. This new law, which covers the non-consensual distribution of private sexual images, is very welcome, but it's limited. And it's limited in one key respect. In order to have a successful prosecution, we have to show that the defendant directly intended to cause distress to his victim. Now, what we find is that this often isn't the case. Sometimes defendants are distributing these images for a laugh. Sometimes they're distributing to make money. Websites will pay for some of these images. Sometimes the images are hacked, as in the Hunger Games actor example. These won't be covered by this new law, so it's a welcome start, but it's very limited. What I would argue is that we should be covering those cases where a defendant simply distributes the images without consent, and that's causing real harm to these victims. So what do we need to be doing now? What does the law need to do now? What I would argue is we need a comprehensive and coherent law reform package. For England and Wales, the law needs to be changed, and other countries need to be thinking about introducing a new law. This law needs to cover classic revenge pornography. It needs to cover upskirting, voyeurism. It needs to cover the distribution of hacked images. It needs to think about what are the real harms that need to be covered here, and that is a breach of privacy, the threat to people's dignity, and we need to be protecting private sexual expression. Ultimately, the law can only do so much, and we need culture change, and that comes through education. That comes through public campaigning. It comes through working in our schools, compulsory sex and relationships education that covers the unacceptable nature of this sort of conduct would be a good first start. And then we can bring about a culture in which this sort of distribution of private sexual images without consent is not acceptable.